Welcome to our PHP web course. We will continue this class by looking at the validation functions in PHP. In PHP, we typically work with forms, and when we retrieve the value from forms, it is important to make sure that they are filled in correctly. If we are trying to retrieve a value from a radio button or a checkbox, and the user has not entered a value, we will get an error message. Therefore, form validation is very important. Forms can be validated on the client side using HTML5 validation and JavaScript. We also can validate form elements using PHP on the server. We will look at some useful functions. The empty function is used to determine if a text box is empty. We typically do not want to be retrieving data from text boxes if there is no value. The empty function is a Boolean function. It essentially returns true or false. It will return true if the value is a 0 as a string, 0 as an integer, an empty string, meaning nothing was entered, null, meaning there's no value, or a value of false. All of these will essentially result in a true. So before we start retrieving values, we want to make sure that the text box is not empty. If it is, we might want to give the user an error message telling them that they need to enter a value. Now, I just said that the empty function is a Boolean function, returning true or false. Well, logically it is. However, it really doesn't return the words true or false. It returns 1 for true, and it actually returns nothing for false. So we're more concerned with whether it is empty or not. So I'm just showing you some interesting code here that allows you to actually test. So here we have the x being set to an empty string. Typically the if statement is used in form validation. So here we have if empty, empty being the conditional. And what did we learn? If this returns true, the code inside the curly braces will be executed. What I'm doing is I'm concatenating a string with the actual function. We learned earlier in this course that you cannot put a function inside the double quotes. It needs to be concatenated. So here we see the output, and the output would actually return the value of 1 in place of the function here. If you look at the second example where we actually have some text, in my if statement, I have a not in front of the empty function. So I'm saying if it's not empty. So if this condition is true, meaning it's not empty, which means that there is something in this variable, then the code inside the curly braces will execute, which it does. And if you notice the output, variable x is, and there is nothing else there, because the function returned nothing for false. So here we see a text box. We're asking for the name. And before you start working with your values from the form, you want to determine whether or not they are empty. There's several ways to go about this. You can test for it being empty, and if it is, you can give an error message. Or you can test for it not being empty. If it's not empty, you could do something. And you could also use the else, meaning it is empty, to give an error message. The isSet function is a valuable function which is used to determine if a radio or checkbox is not checked. When you are retrieving values from a form, if that box has no value, and I don't mean an empty value, I mean no value at all, which is technically null, you will get an error message. You cannot store a value from a form element into a variable if it does not exist. You will get an error message. Therefore, you always want to use the isSet function to make sure that a radio or checkbox has been checked before you try to retrieve its value. This is also a Boolean function, so logically it returns true or false. It returns false if there is no value, which is null, and it will return true for any value, including 0 or false. I would like to point out that an empty string is not a null value. An empty string is a blank character of white space. There is something there. Null means there is no value. Even though we code in a value using HTML, when we code a radio or checkbox, that value is not sent unless the form element is actually checked. isSet actually returns the number 1 for true, and technically nothing for false. So here in the example, we have our variable, and it does have a value. We are using an if conditional, and our condition is the isSet function, and if there is a value, which there is, it will return true. Therefore, the code inside the curly braces will execute. Again, I'm concatenating a string with the function itself, and you can see that the value returned by the function is indeed a 1. Here we have an example of 3 radio buttons, and if we were to store the value being returned in a variable, we would first need to make sure that there is a value there. We could use the isSet function, and if the value does exist, we could execute some code. We also could use an if-else conditional, and we could use the not operator with the isSet function. So if the value is not set, we could give the error message, else we could do something with that code. I would finally like to look at the isNumeric function. This is used to determine if the variable is a number. Again, it is logically Boolean, returning true or false. It will return false if the variable is not a valid numeric value. Again, it logically is Boolean with respect to returning true or false, but in reality it will return the number 1 for true and nothing for false. Here I have 3 examples. I have the value of 32 being stored in a variable x, and now I am echoing a string concatenating with that actual function, and you can see the output does show me that it is returning 1 for the function, meaning it is a valid numeric variable. In the second example, I have the number 32, however, it is enclosed in quotes. If you notice, it is still returning 1, meaning it is a valid numeric variable. The last example, I actually have text, a string text, being stored in this variable. And again, I am echoing my literal, concatenating it with my function, and you can somewhat see that in my output, x is, and then that's it. So the function actually did return nothing. We just can't see it. So if we were to use this to validate data coming out of a text box, we could use the if conditional, and we could have the isNumeric function as our condition, returning true or false. And if it were to return true, we could execute some code to do something. We could also use an if-else. We could use the not operator with this function, meaning it is not a numeric value. And if that were to return true, we could give an error message, else we could do something with that code.